So, do we
Start
go ahead?
talking.
Get going? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Dean, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Sobiak, for coming in today. I do appreciate your time and certainly your support as I was preparing my dissertation. The title of my dissertation is Cultural Mismatch in Pre-Service Teachers of English Learners. And if you are not familiar with it, the primary quantitative vehicle was the CCAI, Cross-Cultural Adaptability Inventory. And we'll be talking about that quite a bit. So I think that as far as the introduction goes, the cultural mismatch between pre-service teachers and English learners is actually pretty problematic. In the US, English learners comprise 9.6% of the public school population in the pre-K-12 environment, but their demographics lead to marginalization within the actual public school setting and in the classrooms. They are dual lingual as opposed to the monolingual teachers who are working with them. They've had prior academic experiences that are typically very different from what the teachers in the US are teaching. They have low socioeconomic status. They're the poorest of the poor. And this is juxtaposed against the white, monolingual, middle-class female teachers who are making up, the majority of the teachers in our public schools. In Florida, the graduation rate for English learners is said to be 62%, but I don't know how much of that, and I've been unable to find out how much of that is included in the ESOL GED versus the actual 4 years of face-to-face college work. We're seeing a loss of culture, we're seeing a loss of language in English learners. We don't see that in their teachers. And, the teachers may or may not know that 80% of the world's languages are actually oral tradition languages. These languages do not have a written component. And in the West, Western cultures rely heavily on written components. So if 80% of the world's languages don't have that, and we are not able to engage our pre-service teachers in that kind of knowledge, then that's another form of bias. We are seeing that for the most part, the teachers, the pre-teachers are unaware of their bias. This is not something that they are deliberately bringing into the classroom, but we do see prejudice, stereotyping, racism, ethnocentrism, particularly nationalism, nativism. Peggy McIntosh in 1988 coined the term white privilege, in which she said that white teachers and white individuals actually have an unrecognized and invisible privilege. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1920 wrote a book called Dark Water, and in the chapter called The Souls of White Folk, he looked at race as a social construct. Garrett in 2016 brought this further into the classroom. Albert Bandura also allowed us to talk about English learners in a slightly different venue, because he would approach the problem through self-efficacy under motivation, and that's really what I was looking at with him. Bandura saw self-efficacy as being a critical element in terms of actually getting people to do what you want them to do. For teachers, and particularly for pre-service teachers, if they don't feel like they can actually do the work, they'll walk away from it and they'll park the student. So the English learner gets stuck behind a computer at the back of the room. We do see that the topic is incredibly significant, I think. We do have to, teach what cultural mismatch is. We have to show bias and what that bias does and create a recognition of it, because if it's not known, it won't be addressed. The questions that I tried to look into in this study included a lessening of bias after completing the cross-cultural communications course. So the treatment was specifically set up to engage and cause interaction between English learners and pre-service teachers. And then the third thing that I looked at were what are the factors that the pre-service teachers bring to the table and say, you know, this is what caused me to, you know, kind of think about what I was doing. The research questions are stated here. Do the pre-service teachers who have completed this ethics course demonstrate a better attitude, a more positive attitude? And would the ethnographic interviews actually create a statistically significant change in biases held by pre-service teachers? And then what are the factors that the pre-service teachers would bring to the table and say, this is what I thought was most helpful to me? There were more than 75 articles reviewed. I started with a review of the literature in which white teachers were teaching white children, then moved into white teachers teaching African American students, and then more recently moved into teachers teaching English learners. The demographics for English learners continue to grow, and multiple studies were examined that would help me to understand the concept of bias as it's seen in the public school systems. The topics included cultural mismatch, white privilege, ethnocentrism, social justice theory, and efforts to mitigate bias within the classroom. The methodology had a quantitative element. The research design included the cross-cultural adaptability inventory, of which I now have 82 copies. It was used pre-test and post-test in the experimental group. The control group also took the cross-cultural adaptability inventory. Treatment consisted of the ethnographic interview with adult English learners conducted between pre-service teachers and adult ELs. The semi-structured focus group had 5 individuals that were drawn from the post-test group. The Likert scale ranking system semi-structured interview allowed me to have triangulation. To be very honest with you, I don't think that the limitations would have really changed the results any. It didn't interfere from my perspective. I can't go out and prevent students from having any interaction at all outside of the classroom with persons whose first language is not English. The study method. The population and the sample mirrored the population of teachers in the classroom with the exception of the 18 to 23-year-old. I do teach college students. That was my study group. The type of study was a quantitative study with qualitative insight. The method was chosen because the study analysis could be understood by incorporating the participants' own words, their qualitative experience as they stated it, with the quantitative data that was right in front of me, easy to prove, and could pretty much not be disputed, to my understanding. In the descriptive statistics, the control and the experimental groups do seem to mirror what we're finding in the actual US population of pre-service teachers. Concerning the quantitative data, let's talk about that for a moment. I did use the cross-cultural adaptability inventory. It had 4 scale dimensions, and those are listed on the slide in front of you. As I was working with these scale dimensions, each one had a different range. Emotional resilience had a range of 0 to 108. Flexibility, openness had a range of 0 to 90. Perceptual acuity had a range of 0 to 60. And personal autonomy had a range of 0 to 42. The data was analyzed using a summary count for each of those scale dimensions. That allowed me to compare student volunteers pre and post test as well as to the control group. So I could do this individually as well as use those counts to then chart the responses and the changes in pre and post test, pre and post treatment groups. All of the questions were answered by all of the students on the CCAI. The results are considered to be valid. The semi-structured focus group data I found helpful. There were 5 students in this group. They were all derived as volunteers from the experimental post-test group, which had a total number of 29 students. I felt that this group was important because they were telling me what they felt was important for them in order to recognize bias and then address it in themselves. These are the questions that I asked them. All of the questions were open-ended in order to avoid yes, no responses. The insights clarified and supported the CCAI quantitative data, and there was also an analysis for sameness of content, which I found to be helpful. In the quantitative data, the summation across the CCAI dimensions gave me those raw scores that I wanted for the control group and for the experimental group pre and post test. This then allowed me to derive the mean, the median, and the standard deviation for all of the groups. And because the scores are valid, the totals are valid. The raw score data collection allowed comparisons between the control group and the pre-test group, between the pre-test and the post-test group, and then finally between the control group and post-test group. The raw score data also allowed me, like I said earlier, to look individually at changes. The assumptions were important, and I looked at random sampling, normality checks, and testing for equal variances. The 3 tests were actually needed for the results. Random sampling was important because the participants in each group had an equal chance of being selected for the study. The normality checks for all 3 groups, control group, pre-test, and post-test, were tested by using QQ plots with Jacques Barra to back it up. The test for equal variances was the 3rd test that was required for the assumptions. This test clarified whether additional testing would assume equal or unequal variances. Now, breaking down the normality checks for each group. In the control group, the Jacques Barra test had an alpha level of 0.05 and a chi-square value of 0.7025. The QQ plot is normal because the spread of points for the actual values is close to the expected values. This gave me a symmetrical distribution. The null hypothesis failed to be rejected. The data is normal. In the pre-test group, the Jacques Barra test alpha level was 0.05 and the chi-square value was 0.0766. The QQ plot again gave the symmetrical distribution. The null hypothesis failed to be rejected. Data is normal. In the post-test group, Jacques Barra test alpha level of 0.05 and a chi-square value of 1.2175. QQ plot demonstrated that actual values varied just a little bit from the expected, but the Jacques Barra test failed to reject the null hypothesis, so the data is normal. The test for equal variances was needed in order to determine whether the variances could be assumed unequal or equal, because we don't know the variances for each of the sample groups. The F-test 2 sample for variances was run for all 3. The control and post-test. In that running, we cannot assume equal variances, so the test needed was for unequal variances. In the pre and post tests, those were also run. Variances were assumed equal, but the test was actually not needed. The F-test, two sample for variances, was used because there were two samples and there were two groups. The F-test in particular was helpful because the chi-square is used to find out whether there is any variance between the two samples. The F-test is the ratio of variance between two samples. In the check for outliers, the difference in pre and post-test data groups as paired samples was completed. There were no values below the minimum bounds of -37. There were no values above the maximum bound of 51. In the final tests and conclusions, the slide does explain that it was a two-sample, two-tailed t-test for unequal variances. The two samples were used because it did have two groups. I was always comparing two groups. The t-test allowed me to do this, even though I didn't know all of the variances for the populations. The null hypothesis is rejected. That means that there's a significant difference between the control group and the pretest group data, and that is exactly what I would have wanted as I started the study. In test 2, again, two-sample, two-tailed t-test for unequal variances. They were found to be unequal. And although the null hypothesis failed to be rejected, this is actually a very positive outcome for what I was doing. Because I was comparing the control group to the post-test treatment group, then yes, I did want the post-test to come closer to the control group. That's why it's a positive outcome instead of a negative. The null hypothesis did fail to be rejected. In the third sample, in test 3, the null hypothesis was rejected, indicating again that there is a significant difference between pre-test and post-test data. Again, this is something that I would have wanted to see. I felt pretty confident with all 3 of those results. In the findings, the research question and hypothesis 1, do pre-service teachers who have completed the ethics course with an ethnographic interview in the ESOL endorsement sequence, that's my control group, demonstrate more positive attitudes toward ELVs than pre-service teachers who have not? The results did indicate that based on CCAI scores, that the control group had lower bias and higher tolerance. Pre-test experimental group scores indicated higher bias and lower tolerance. The alternative hypothesis was not proven true here, so the null failed to be rejected. We can see in table 4.13 a little bit more information about this data. In research question and hypothesis 2, we looked at the interviews between the actual ethnographic interviews between the pre-service teachers and the adult ESOL learners. And the CCAI scores, post-test experimental, moved closer to the control group. And I found this to be an excellent outcome. The results of the summation across the CCAI scale dimensions did allow me to see this shift, and the null hypothesis failed to be rejected, which is fine. In other words, the alternative hypothesis was not proven true. Table 4.14 explicates this somewhat better. Research question and hypothesis 3, regarding the focus group interview. This interview gave me a little bit of qualitative data to kind of support and further explain the quantitative statistics that I had already put together. The results of the qualitative analysis gave me new information that I can use actually in future studies. I thought that was a good thing. Table 4.15 does give me a little bit more information about my pre and post totals. In the analysis of the results, there was a change, a significant change, 0.96% from pre-test to post-test in the CCAI in the group means. Qualitative results did confirm and gave additional understandings. It's interesting to me that for question 1, the students gave remarks saying that they were nervous, that they were anxious, that they were afraid of offending the students. In question 2, there were some stereotypes even after the interview, and those stereotypes were interesting. They were afraid that the students were older than they were expecting, like they had a certain age range in mind and the students were a little older. But they also noted in question 2, how did you feel after you had met with the English learners? They talked about the courage that the English learners showed when they came to the US with nothing and started over. On question 3, this talked about language proficiency. I was really interested in this because I did want to see if the students who have had actually no training in BICS and CALP could recognize the difference between social language and academic language. The interview, the ethnographic interview, was conducted using social language, using vetted questions that had been approved by the international community before they were given to the students. This difference did show that the students failed to understand the difference between BICS and CALP. No surprises there. The next question, I did think question 4 was, the results were interesting because 4 out of the 5 students in the focus group said to me that they were expecting all of the students to be Hispanic or to be Spanish speakers. And one student went so far as to say that she had been practicing her Spanish the night before so that she could be sure and speak to the learners as they came in. What happened though was that all of our students were either from Africa or from the Caribbean, and none of them spoke Spanish. And in terms of recognizing bias, I thought it was very helpful that one of the students from Africa brought up images, photos taken of her hometown in Africa. It is a big city. The students who were pre-service teachers were very surprised. They talked to me afterwards in the control group that they had been relying on stereotypes regarding Africa, that they had expected almost to see something that they called huts in place of this major metropolitan area. In terms of the findings, there has actually been pretty limited research that talks about pre-service teachers and English learners. There's a lot of research that talks about teachers and English learners, but when you consider that, at least in the hallways here, 50% of the teachers will not return to teaching after 1 year, and within 5 years, 80% of those teachers are gone. So we need, I think, more research on pre-service teachers because it seems like we know what's happening with the teachers right now. The best time to do that, as a parent, I'm looking for the formative period, and this is it. The undergraduate 4-year cycle is the formative period for English learners, for pre-service teachers of English learners. In the ESOL curriculum, as it's taught in Florida, cross-cultural communications is required, and this can be done with an ethics base, and the ethics base can then be used to teach what bias is, to teach recognition of it. I also found it helpful to reframe my students' thinking, to approach this as an opportunity for a conversation with other students. Since these pre-service teachers are students, then they were able to find similarities when they thought of English learners as students, and also to reframe it as guests, because there are certain behaviors that are culturally acceptable with guests. And so I wanted to be sure that they were able to reframe it and give it an additive instead of a subtractive understanding. In the discussion of the findings, the emotional resilience group had a control group mean of 81. This gave them a high degree of the flexibility and adaptability that is actually really, really helpful in reducing cultural mismatch. Bandura talked about this in terms of self-efficacy. If you understand what you are doing and how to do it, then your motivation will actually be much higher and your results should be higher too. In contrast, the pre-test experimental group had a group mean of 76.83 in emotional resilience. They didn't have a clue. Really, they just did not know what to do, and pre-test were very anxious. They said that in their qualitative report. So they fell back on known and familiar precepts. This indicates a high cultural mismatch. This indicates a low self-efficacy. In flexibility and openness, the control group mean of 59.14 and pre-test experimental group mean of 56.14 did show a nice, robust change. So we do want to see the ability to demonstrate an emotional connection toward cultural norms that may not be our own, but which we can incorporate into the classroom and certainly accept as a part of who that student is. Bandura would think of this as indicating higher self-efficacy because you know what to do, you know how to do it, and you know why you're doing it. Pre-service teachers, however, really didn't fit that model very well from a lack of training. And that showed that they were still using in-group status markers to be that which fit their own known, comfortable cultural precepts. Perceptual acuity also had quite a difference between the control group and the pre-test group. This is pretty important because cultural norms determine how we communicate and what we accept as being the quote-unquote the correct way to communicate with others. And when we don't know that, we're just at a loss. We can see this gap between the control group and the pre-test group. So educators in training in the pre-test group they didn't have any kind of understanding of verbal and nonverbal communication skills. So their scores were lower. In personal autonomy, this is actually the finding where the scores were the closest, although we're still seeing Bandura's thinking coming in because these scores did increase following the ethnographic interview. We do need to be sure as professors of pre-service teachers that we're cultivating an attitude of willingness ourselves, because this is how we teach social justice theory. And if we want our students to be fair to English learners, we need to model that behavior and also talk about that behavior and talk about why we do this and ask for the students to give us examples when they don't understand what bias is. And, can we talk about this and see how we interface with each other and how we interface with persons that we think of as others. The implications for practice say that we need a lot of different strategies to work with English with pre-service teachers who will soon be teaching English learners. And right now, there's not a lot of research out there about the ethnographic interviews. This past weekend, I did go with my daughter to another university here in town, and while I was waiting for her to finish her youth orchestra, I was able to overhear college students who are taking a cross-cultural communications class as education majors. They were assigned to interview a student in an ethnographic interview, so they interviewed each other. So quite literally, they were interviewing their best friends and didn't interview persons from other cultures. They were just really only understanding themselves better. The ethnographic interview can be reshaped and use English learners, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that at the university level. In terms of recommendations for future research, I think that all of these recommendations are helpful. And the reason I think that is because they do support the social justice theory in that they are looking at pre-service teachers and doing so in a way that's fair, that produces equity, that is respectful, and that will allow us, if we do follow this kind of research, will allow us to know more about the attitudes of the parents as it regards the pre-service teachers. I think we don't really know anything right now about that. The conclusions. We did find overall that in pre-test indicators, the group mean of 213.38 on the CCAI did go up quite a bit. It went up to 220.52 with just the ethnographic interview and really no other interventions or treatments given. This brought the pre-treatment group, the experimental pre-test group, into a much closer relationship with the control group, who have already demonstrated and already had plenty of coursework to give them more robust understanding of bias recognition and also what to do about bias when you see it in yourself. In education, the findings indicate that ethnographic interviews should be used, I think, actually with people outside of your own culture group instead of with your best friend, who's probably going to share most of your culture. These ethnographic interviews can be included in the cross-cultural communications class and be used for the teaching of ethics as it relates to bias recognition and bias elimination. My references are here. Thank you.
At the top, there's a little icon you should see at the top where you can stop your share.
Okay. Pause share. Got it. And stop share.
Stop share.
Got it.
Dr. Taylor, do you have questions for Anna?
Are you kidding? She said so much stuff. Where do we begin? Let's start with the most important question. Yeah, you said a bunch of stuff. What'd you learn? You got 2 or 3 sentences.
What did I learn quantitatively?
What did you learn in 2 or 3 sentences? Forget all that researchy stuff you just said. The 2 or 3 sentences, tell me what you got to share with people. What is it?
So what I learned that is most important is that we're really not, I hate to say this, we're really not doing our best right now in terms of teaching bias recognition, and we need to do this in a way that is always sensitive, but we also need to be more proactive in terms of teaching bias, because if we're losing, 50% of our teachers after the first year, and then 80% of those teachers go within the first 5 years, then there's a reason for that. And part of that could be, probably is, the increasing English learner population.
Okay. And if somebody asked you, is this a quantitative study or a qualitative study, what's your short answer?
It's a quantitative study with qualitative insights.
Dead on. Okay. I really think that you covered all of the detailed things that I would want to ask. But the fact that you can give it to me briefly like that means you actually know what it all meant.
Yes, I do.
And this is deeply personal, but at the same time, you used all those techniques to remain objective. So,
Thank you.
Dr. Sobiak.
Hey, Anna, good job. One quick question for you.
Yes.
What would you do differently if you were to start your project again, if anything?
If I were to start my project again, I would give myself more time to process the information, and I might throw out question 3 that talked about English language proficiency and substitute a question that was maybe not so far-reaching, that was more like, oh, this is white privilege, or did you notice white privilege? Do you understand that as it relates to English learners? So I would probably take out question 3, and I would also give myself more time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you think it's possible for white people to understand white privilege?
Yes, I do. But I don't think that most white people that I've met feel comfortable thinking about it. And I think we have a way to go yet.
How do you think, I mean, your sample was 18 to 23. If you had a group of pre-service teachers that were 40 to 55, do you think that the results would have been any different?
Well, looking at my demographics, I do have quite a few students in that age range, although the majority fit into 18 to 23. What I'm finding is that by the time my students, because I teach students from 18 to 60, so what I'm finding in that age range is that my students who are more mature in terms of their life experiences and who have had more life experiences are already less biased. They're farther away from those early teachings, and they are really way more willing to go into the classroom and make that classroom an equitable situation. And they're really very interested in learning about the techniques that improve second language acquisition among English learners. I find them to be like amazing students. They're right there. They're willing to do this. They're willing to do the work because they've already been distanced from those earlier stereotypes that they may have grown up with.
How do you plan to share this research?
I will make the corrections, and then I was able to, blank out all of the different names on there, so I feel like I'm not going to be violating anybody's trust. And I would like to see if there is a conference that would allow me to present it, or if there's a journal that would allow me to publish it.
There is, but we can talk about how to break that up after we have our little powwow behind your back.
Okay.
I guess one more question, and this is really for the people that I want to show this later, future students. You had so many really technical methods that you employed and multiple means of measuring the assumptions. How in the world did you learn all that?
When I needed to learn how to speak a foreign language, French or Russian, German, Hindi, I asked for help. And I am not afraid of asking for help when I need to know more about statistics. So I went to a statistician and I said, this is my data. I need to know how I can articulate my data in a way that is truthful and meaningful. And working with an expert seemed to make all of the difference.
And yeah, on top of just that, your motivation and the just having data to attach these ideas to instead of the general malaise of learning some technique which you may or may not use. You know, it just makes it easier to learn when you're motivated.
I was
Anyway,
extremely motivated.
that's a great, it really is a great answer, because it would take an entire PhD program to teach one small section of all the methods that you could possibly be used. And it's the power of being able to select methods and then go figure out how to do it that is really the strength that you showed here.
Well, and Excel is pretty helpful too.
Oh, I love Excel.
Yes.
All right.
And you know, I think that the other thing about through this process, obviously Anna is a linguist. I mean, anybody who speaks how many languages?
5.
5. Okay. Does that include English?
Yes.
All right. Anybody who can speak 5 languages and who undertakes a dissertation and finds themselves drawn to a quantitative study, it is about personal growth.
I do think that statistically speaking, I probably grew. Yes.
Statistically significant results there. All
Yeah,
right.
Are there
definitely.
any other questions for Anna at this point?
Nope.
Anna, if you will leave the meeting, do you know how to leave the meeting?
Let me see. I think it may actually be under my camera. No. Is there a bar? Leave, mute, leave. Got it. Okay, bye.
Wait.
No, not yet.
Okay, and then I will call you back and you will join the meeting by the same link that you had before through the email.
Okay.
All right?
All right.
And I'll call you.